The blizzard shrieked like a living thing as it tore across the open plains, a savage howl that promised death to anything foolish enough to stand in its path. Inside a lone, weather-beaten cabin, another struggle was unfolding. A solitary woman, Mara Whitlock, stood frozen, staring down at the man she had dragged from the snow with her own bleeding hands. He was not only wounded, he was Apache, the sworn enemy of settlers all across the frontier. Mara knew that saving him could cost her far more than her life to the storm. If word spread, her own people would finish what the cold had begun. What she did not yet know was that the fevered man bleeding onto her cabin floor was no ordinary warrior. He was the brother of the most feared Apache, war chief alive Nantan. Outside, the wind behaved like a starving beast, clawing at the thin log walls of Mara Whitlock's cabin, screaming with a rage that felt deliberate, almost personal. The sound rattled the single-glass pane in her window and vibrated deep into her bones. For 2 relentless days, snow had fallen like a blinding curtain, erasing the familiar shape of the Arizona territory and reducing the world to nothing more than the 4 walls of her home. Only the crackle of the fire kept the silence at bay, along with the hollow loneliness that had settled in since her husband Luke Whitlock had been buried beneath a plain wooden cross 1 year earlier. Then came a pause, a false mercy from the storm. In that fragile lull, she heard it. A sound so faint it nearly vanished beneath the wind's roar. A low, broken moan. Mara's hand froze above the cast-iron skillet on the stove. It made no sense. The nearest homestead lay a full day's ride away, and no sane soul would be wandering in this storm. Her heart slammed against her ribs, wild and frantic like a trapped bird fighting for escape. Fear crept in, sharp and icy. It could be a trick, a raiding party using the storm as cover. The stories she had heard in Prescott of Apache attacks and ruthless retaliation flooded her thoughts. She reached for the rifle resting against the wall. The cold weight of the stock steadied her trembling hands. Holding it close, she moved toward the window and scraped away a small patch of frost. At first she saw nothing, then a dark smear against the endless white. A horse stood there riderless, head bowed against the wind, its coat crusted with ice. Several yards away, half swallowed by a growing drift, lay another shape. Human. Mara caught her breath. Survive. Every day. That was the rule. Luke had always told her that survival was the only law that mattered out here. But another voice spoke inside her, quiet, stubborn, impossible to silence. It was her father's voice. Samuel Whitlock, a doctor who had believed every life held value, who had taught her that compassion was not weakness, but strength of the highest kind. Cursing her own softness, Mara pulled on. Luke's heavy winter coat, the wool still carrying faint traces of tobacco and pine. She wrapped a thick scarf around her face, grabbed a lantern, and unbolted the door. The wind struck her like a solid wall, ripping the breath from her lungs and slamming icy fabric against her legs. The cold burned sharp and vicious, forcing tears from her eyes. She pushed forward through deepening snow, every step an act of defiance. In places, the drifts reached her waist and the wind-driven ice bit at her cheeks like needles. The horse, a powerful Appaloosa, whinnied weakly as she approached. Its saddle lay empty, stained dark with blood. Nearby, a man lay face down in the snow. Buckskin clung to his broad frame, long black hair spread around his head like a dark halo. Apache. The word sent fear racing through her, but the sight of blood soaking into the snow silenced it. Red against white, a brutal contrast. A crude bandage bound his thigh, soaked through and useless. She knelt beside him, fingers numb as she brushed snow from his back. "Hey," she called, her voice nearly lost to the storm. "Can you hear me?" No answer. She pressed 2 fingers to his neck, searching blindly. They're faint, uneven but real. A pulse. He was alive. For now. Getting him back to the cabin felt impossible. He was tall, powerfully built. An unconscious weight turned him into stone. She tried to lift him, boots sliding, muscles screaming. It was hopeless until desperation sparked an idea. She tore the saddle blanket from the Appaloosa. It was stiff with ice, but it would have to work. Drawing on a strength she never knew she had, Mara rolled the man onto the blanket, gasping as cold air burned her lungs. She tied the blanket's corners together with a rope from the saddle, forming a crude travois. The horse was too weak and frightened to help. The burden fell to her alone. She looped the rope over her shoulder and leaned forward, dragging him inch by inch through the storm. Snow clawed at her boots. Wind fought every step. A journey of 100 yards stretched into a nightmare that felt endless, like pulling a soul back from death itself. The wind screamed and clawed at Mara Whitlock, fighting to tear the weight from her hands. Snow blinded her, and more than once she slipped and went down hard, the man's body dragging her with him. Each time she forced herself upright, her thoughts dulled by pain and exhaustion, driven forward by a raw, stubborn refusal to quit. Her father's face rose in her mind, Samuel Whitlock, gentle and unyielding, and the words he had taught her beat like a drum in her head. All life is precious, Mara, all life. At last she reached the cabin. Her body shook as she staggered through the doorway, hauling the man inside, before collapsing to the floor. The heavy oak door slammed shut, and the storm's fury dropped to a distant, furious growl. For a long moment she lay there gasping, the heat from the fire easing the agony in her frozen skin. Then she pushed herself up and crawled to him. He was still out cold, breathing shallow and uneven. Firelight revealed a hard, striking face, severe angles, high cheekbones, a strong jaw. A jagged scar cut from his temple down to his chin on the left side, a mark carved by violence. With trembling hands, Mara began the careful, dangerous work of tending his wounds. She cut away the leg of his buckskin trousers and exposed a deep gash in his thigh. A bullet wound, angry swollen. The bleeding had slowed, but infection lurked close. She cleaned it with hot water and carbolic soap, fighting nausea at the sight of torn flesh. He groaned, even unconscious, his body tightening with pain. As she worked, she found another injury, a nasty split on his scalp, hidden beneath thick, dark hair. That wound explained the fever. She cleaned it too, as gently as she could. She bound both injuries with clean linen torn from one of her own chemises, her heart pounding with fear and a strange, unfamiliar resolve. She was breaking every frontier rule, hiding an enemy, a man who might kill her the moment he woke. And if he were discovered here, men like her neighbor, the hard-eyed rancher Silas Crow, would show her no mercy either. She dragged him closer to the fire, set his head on a pillow, and pulled a heavy wool blanket over him. Then she sank into a chair, bones aching with a weariness that reached deep inside her. The storm raged on, but inside the cabin, there was only the still form of the Apache warrior by her hearth. She watched him for hours as firelight danced across his face. Who was he? What had brought him here? And what would she do when he opened his eyes? The questions churned as relentlessly as the snow outside. She had saved his life, and in doing so, bound her own fate to a man from a world she had been taught to fear. The weight of that choice pressed down on her, heavy and uncertain. She had risked everything on a single act of mercy and could only pray it would not destroy her. The night stretched on, filled with the wind's howl and the rough, uneven breathing of the wounded Apache. And for the first time since Luke Whitlock had died, Mara was not truly alone. Yet she had never felt more afraid. For 2 days the man drifted in and out of a fevered haze. Mara rarely left his side, coaxing broth and water past cracked lips, changing bandages, feeding the fire to keep the cold from creeping back in. On the third morning, the storm finally broke, leaving behind a world remade silent, pristine, blinding white beneath a sharp blue sky. The beauty outside clashed with the tension inside the cabin. In his fever, he spoke in a language she did not know, harsh sounds and clipped phrases spilling from him. At times he cried out, body arching in pain, and she pressed a cool cloth to his brow, murmuring steady words he could not understand but seemed to feel. During those long hours, she studied him. His hands were scarred and calloused hands, shaped by war. Along his forearms, fine tattoos traced suns and eagles, signs of a people rich in meaning and art. Curiosity crept in, pushing aside some of her fear. He was not the savage the men in Prescott claimed. He was a man with a past and a people of his own. By late afternoon, on the third day, the fever broke. Mara had dozed in her chair when a sound snapped her awake. His eyes were open, dark, sharp, wary, like a wolf cornered. They stared at each other in silence, the air thick with unspoken danger. He tried to rise, a hiss of pain cutting from his lips, as his injured leg betrayed him. "Easy, Mara," said, her voice calm but firm. She stood slowly, hands open to show no threat. "You're safe here. You've been badly hurt." He did not seem to grasp her words, but he caught her meaning. His eyes tracked every move she made, his hands sliding inch by inch toward the knife still tucked in his belt. Mara noticed it, and her heart jumped hard into her throat. She had considered taking the blade while he lay unconscious, then decided against it, fearing it would only ignite violence when he woke. "I mean, you no harm," she said, forcing calm into her voice. She motioned to the clean wrappings on his leg and head. "I found you in the snow. I brought you here. I treated your wounds." He spoke in his own tongue, his voice rough and dry. It sounded like a question. When she didn't answer, frustration flickered across his face. He pointed to his chest. "Koa," he said, clear, steady, strong, despite the weakness in him. Then he pointed to her eyes, dark and searching. "Mara," she answered. "My name is Mara Whitlock." "Mara," he repeated the word, strange on his tongue. Something fragile settled between them, then an unspoken ceasefire. He remained cautious, but the edge of violence dulled. He let her bring a bowl of broth which he drank slowly, almost carefully, never taking his eyes off her. The days that followed became a quiet, careful rhythm, two strangers sharing the same small space. They spoke in gestures and broken words. He learned water-fire food. She learned his words for pain, thanks, and horse. She discovered his Appaloosa tough smart had survived the storm and now stood in her lean-to, chewing what little hay she could spare. She also learned that Koa carried immense pride and resolve. First he sat up, then he stood. Finally he took short, painful steps across the cabin, his face locked in grim determination. He said little, but his eyes spoke volumes. Gratitude, sorrow, and something deeper she could not yet name. One afternoon, while Mara mended a tear in his buckskin shirt, her fingers tracing the beadwork, he spoke. "Why?" he asked softly. It was one of the few English words he had learned. "Why what?" Mara asked. He gestured around the cabin, then to himself. "Why? Save Apache." Mara set her sewing aside and met his gaze. How could she explain it? The fear, the compassion, the stubborn refusal to surrender to hatred. "My father was a doctor," she said slowly, hoping he would understand. "Samuel Whitlock taught me that a life is a life, no matter a man's skin." She looked toward the window, out at the endless snow. And out here we're all just trying to survive. Something passed through his eyes, understanding, maybe respect. He nodded once. Later that day he showed her something that chilled her blood. From a small leather pouch around his neck he drew out a worn silver locket. Inside was a tiny portrait of a young Apache woman holding a baby. He pointed to the woman, then to himself, joining two fingers together, his wife. Then to the child, his face tightening with grief. He drew a finger across his throat. No words were needed. Mara's chest ached. She knew that loss, the hollow, endless grief of losing a spouse. She reached out and rested her hand on his arm. He did not pull away. In that moment, they were not settler and warrior. They were two souls marked by the same wound. The thaw came slowly outside and within. Snow receded, revealing dark earth beneath. And the walls between Mara and Koa weakened, replaced by a fragile, growing bond. But the world beyond the cabin had not forgotten them. One morning, Mara spotted a rider in the distance. Her stomach sank. It was Silas Crow, her nearest neighbor, a big, broad man with a booming voice and eyes hard as river stone, his hatred for Apache as wide as the territory itself. "Koa," she whispered urgently. "You have to hide." He understood at once. Without a word, he took his knife and slipped into the root cellar beneath the floorboards, pulling the trapdoor shut, just as a heavy fist slammed against the door. Mara drew a steadying breath, fixed calm onto her face, and opened it. "Silas," she said, forcing a smile. "What brings you out this way?" Mara Whitlock asked. Silas Crow's eyes slid past her shoulder, sweeping the cabin like a hawk searching for movement. "Just checking on neighbors. After the storm," he said, his voice a low rasp. "Heard some odd talk." He spat a stream of tobacco juice near the doorstep. "Folks in town say a band of Chiricahua renegades was seen up this way before the snows came, led by that devil Nantan himself." "You haven't noticed anything strange, have you?" Mara's heart hammered. Beneath the floorboards, she could feel Koa's presence, silent, hidden, dangerous. "No, Silas," she said, the lie steady on her tongue. "Just me and the storm. Mean one." Crow grunted, eyes narrowing. "You look rattled." "I'm fine," Mara replied, hardening her tone. "Been managing just fine on my own." He lingered, making small talk edged with suspicion. His gaze never settling, always searching. At last, to Mara's deep relief, he swung back into the saddle and rode off. She waited until he shrank to a dark speck against the land before lifting the trapdoor. Koa rose from the cellar, his face set and dark. He had heard everything. He looked at her, and something new filled his eyes, not gratitude alone, but something heavier. A shared danger, a debt that could never be paid. He moved to the window, watched Silas Crow disappear, then turned back with an intensity that tightened Mara's chest. He touched his chest. "Koa." Then he swept his hand wide as if claiming the mountains, the plains, the whole world. "Chiricahua." He paused, then spoke a name that sent ice through her veins, a name whispered in fear across every campfire and settlement. "Nantan." He pointed to himself again, then pressed his hand to his heart. "Brother." The floor seemed to drop away. The man she had saved, sheltered, protected, was not just any Apache warrior. He was the brother of the most feared leader on the frontier. She had not invited danger into her home. She had welcomed the storm itself. Her mercy had turned into treason, and she knew with bone-deep certainty that the true reckoning had only begun. The truth hung between them, thick and suffocating like heat after the thaw. Nantan. To settlers, the name was a curse, a phantom of fire and blood. To the Chiricahua, he was a visionary, a spiritual force, their last hope. And the man standing in her cabin was his brother. Dizziness washed over Mara. She sank into a chair, memories crashing in stories of raids and slaughter, now wearing a human face. The face of the man who had slept by her fire, eaten her food, trusted her hands with his life. Koa watched her, unreadable. He knew the weight of that name. He had chosen to tell her an act of trust, or a warning. "You should have let me die out there," Mara whispered, her voice shaking. He shook his head. Crossing to the hearth, he picked up a piece of charcoal and began to draw on the smooth stone. His hands moved with quiet precision. A village, women and children, then riders with rifles and blue coats. Fire, chaos, death. He pointed to the flames, then to the locket at his chest. His wife Aini, their child Tala. They had not been killed by rival tribes, but by Mexican soldiers, bounty hunters, paid for Apache scalps. His loyalty to Nantan, his commitment to war, was forged, not from bloodlust, but from grief sharpened into steel. Mara watched transfixed as the story unfolded in stark lines of black and gray. For the first time, she saw the other side, the pain and desperation that fueled the Apache wars. It did not excuse the violence, but it gave it shape. A terrible human logic. Their bond deepened there, tempered by isolation and the secret that bound them. Koa taught her more of his language. She taught him more English. They shared stories of lost loves and broken worlds. He spoke of mountains and deserts, of spirits in wind and trees, of a way of life slipping toward extinction. She told Koa about Ohio, the soft green hills, the slow rivers, and the hopes that had carried her west. Those hopes had crumbled into dust with Luke Whitlock's death. In sharing those memories, they found an unexpected kinship, two souls set adrift by a world that had stripped them bare. A thin, fragile sense of normal life returned to the cabin. With his leg nearly healed, Koa helped with the daily work. He split wood with steady, efficient swings, his strength quiet and grounding. He showed her how to read tracks, how to listen to the land, how to find water where the earth looked dead. In return, she taught him to sound out a few words from her tattered Bible, the only book she owned. Even so, the shadow beyond their walls never lifted. Silas Crow began coming by more often, his suspicion sharpening with each visit. He asked pointed questions, eyes combing the cabin for signs of another presence. He noted her dwindling firewood and the large tracks in the mud near the house, too big to be hers. Mara learned to deflect him with growing ease, but she knew the truth could not stay buried forever. The danger crested one hot afternoon in late spring. She was in her small garden, tending new shoots of corn and beans, when the sound of hooves reached her ears. This time it wasn't just Crow. 4 men rode in a grim-faced Red Rock posse, rifles ready. Crow led them, his expression set with hard satisfaction. Mara, he called, his voice carrying across the clearing. "We've got business with you." Her blood ran cold. Koa was inside the cabin, sharpening his knife. There was no time to hide him. She walked toward the riders, hands shaking, buying seconds where she could. "Silas," she said tightly, "what's this about?" "Don't play dumb," Crow snapped. "We know you're hiding one of them. An Apache's horse left tracks a few miles back, straight to your place." The other men spread out rifles trained on the cabin door. "Come out, you murdering heathen," one shouted. "You're surrounded." The door opened, but it wasn't Koa who stepped into the light. It was Mara, pale but steady. Luke's rifle braced in her hands. "There's no one here but me," she said, forcing conviction she didn't feel. "You're mistaken. Now get off my land." Crow laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Put the gun down, Mara. You don't have it in you." He started to dismount, a cruel grin spreading. "We'll search ourselves, and then we'll see who's got the stomach." A deep, calm voice cut through the moment. "Leave her alone." Koa stepped out beside her, knife in hand, eyes burning with cold resolve. He stood at Mara's shoulder, silent, lethal. The men stared, stunned. They'd expected a frightened fugitive, not a warrior standing tall. "Well, I'll be damned," Crow said, recovering. "Look what we've got, a Chiricahua and his white protector." Mara flinched. Koa did not. "I said leave her alone," he repeated, his English slow and measured. "This isn't her fight. It is now." Crow replied, lifting his rifle. "You're far from your reservation, Apache. You just made your last mistake." Time slowed. Mara heard her own heart thunder. She saw Crow's finger tighten, the dark barrel centered on Koa's chest. Without thinking, she stepped in front of him, raising her rifle. "No!" she screamed. The world cracked open with gunfire, but not from Crow's weapon. A shot rang out from the rocks above the cabin, a place no one had watched. Crow jerked, shock flashing across his face as he staggered back, a dark stain spreading across his chest. He toppled from the saddle, his body striking the earth with a heavy, lifeless thud. The other men froze stunned, then lifted their eyes toward the rocks above. Cut sharp against the bright blue sky stood a dozen Apache warriors. Their rifles were leveled at the Red Rock posse, and at their head stood a man with a hawk's face and eyes lit by a fierce inner flame, a figure Mara Whitlock recognized at once, though she had only ever heard his name spoken in fear. Nantan. He had come for his brother, and in doing so he had spared Mara's life. Outmatched and terrified, the posse let their weapons fall. Hands rose in surrender. Nantan and his warriors flowed down from the rocks, swift and silent as shadows. They closed in around the trembling men from Prescott, faces hard and unyielding. Koa moved to his brother's side, and the two clasped forearms in a powerful greeting. Then Nantan turned his gaze on Mara. His eyes were piercing, as if they stripped away every secret, every doubt she carried. He spoke to Koa in their own tongue, his voice low and rumbling. Koa answered just as quietly, gesturing to Mara, then the cabin, then the fresh grave of Silas Crow. Nantan listened, unreadable. When he looked back at Mara, something like approval crossed his face. He spoke a single word in English, both question and judgment. You. His voice grated like stone on stone. You saved him. Mara could only nod, her throat too dry for words. Nantan snapped an order. Two warriors seized the captured men and dragged them toward their horses. Whatever waited for them would not be merciful. Then Nantan approached Mara, his movements fluid, predatory. He stopped only a few steps away, his presence overwhelming. He was not tall yet. Authority radiated from him. You have a strong heart, white woman. He said, his tone softer, but edged with steel. You showed my brother a kindness your people never did. His gaze swept over the small cabin, the garden, the hard-won life she had carved from unforgiving land. This place is no longer safe. White men will come, many of them. They will see only a dead man and an Apache. They will call you traitor. They will show no mercy. He was right. Mara knew it. Her compassion had carried her to a crossroads she could not escape. Saving Koa had cost her the life she once knew. Come with us, Koa said quietly. It's the only way. Mara looked at the cabin, the only home she'd known since Luke Whitlock died. She looked at Crow's grave, then at Koa's steady eyes, and at Nantan, the war chief offering the only protection left to her. Stay and face her own people, or follow the Apache into a world of danger and exile. She remembered her father's belief in shared humanity. She had followed her conscience this far. She took a breath and nodded once. I'll come, she said, clear and firm. Nantan gave a curt nod and issued a command. Two warriors brought out her horse and Koa's Appaloosa. Mara took one last look at the cabin and turned away, stepping toward the waiting horses and a future as vast and uncertain as the mountains ahead. She was no longer Mara Whitlock, lonely widow of the Arizona frontier. She was the woman who had risked everything for an Apache warrior, the woman who now rode with Nantan. Her old life was finished. A harder, more dangerous one had begun. The world blurred into stone and sky as the Chiricahua moved like ghosts through brutal, breathtaking land. Guided by Nantan, they abandoned all known trails, slipping into hidden canyons and rock-strewn passes known only to them. They moved like the mountain wind passing through the land without a mark. For Mara Whitlock, each day became a lesson in endurance. Her muscles burned, her bones ached, yet her spirit adapted, tempered by the frontier life she already knew. Koa stayed close, her constant shadow and living bridge between the world she'd lost and the perilous one she'd entered. Patient and steady, he taught her to read the land's quiet signs, to find water where there seemed to be none, to build a fire that warmed without betraying smoke. Warriors who had first watched her with hard suspicion began to notice the steel beneath her calm. They remembered the courage that had carried her through the standoff with the Red Rock posse. In time, they gave her a name spoken first with caution, then with respect that grew. Day by day, Ashka, the woman with the strong heart. Life ran tight as a drawn wire. They were fugitives, hunted by two nations. Fear tasted metallic and constant, sharpening her senses. Any sound, any shifting shadow could mean cavalry and blood. Yet danger did not always come from beyond the camp. Nantan, hawk-eyed and unreadable, watched her closely, his thoughts sealed. Though he allowed her presence, she knew she was a point of tension. That tension snapped one evening in a high mountain meadow as autumn sharpened the air. A warrior named Varric, his face set in bitterness from a family lost to soldiers, strode into the firelight. His fury fixed on Mara. Words spilled from him in a rush of harsh Apache accusation, cutting the air as he gestured toward her. Mara did not need the language to feel the sting. Curse, weakness, omen. Koa was on his feet at once, hand on his knife, answering in a low, dangerous growl. Pride and hatred flared between the two men. The camp held its breath. Nantan let the anger run its course, his face as still as stone. Then with a slight lift of his hand, silence fell. His voice came calm and absolute. He spoke of honor, of the life debt owed to Ashka, of courage, shown without reason or reward. His gaze swept the circle before settling on Mara. Ashka, he said his words carrying into the twilight. You are not Apache. You never will be. He paused, letting the truth land. But you have a warrior's heart. You have earned your place at this fire. His eyes hardened as flint when they turned to Varric. She is under my protection. If harm comes to her from any hand, you will answer to me. Varric glared venom, bright in his eyes, but he fell silent. The challenge ended. The hatred did not. Mara understood then that while she had protectors, she had also gained a mortal enemy. As seasons turned and the band moved south toward the refuge of the Sierra Madre, the bond between Mara and Koa deepened beyond friendship. Beneath desert skies strewn with stars, they shared the ruins of their pasts. Koa spoke of a freedom fading like morning mist of a people pushed toward erasure. Mara spoke of simple dreams, a home, of family dreams she thought had been buried with Luke Whitlock. In each other's stories they found solace. One evening, as the setting sun painted the peaks in fire and gold, Koa took her hand, gentle sure. Mara, he said softly above the crackle of the fire, my heart is no longer my own. It belongs to you. Her breath caught. She had felt the pull between them, but hearing the words made it real and frightening. To love him was to choose flight and hardship, to live beneath the shadow of death. Yet in his eyes she saw kindness, honor, and a strength born of the soul. And my heart is yours, Koa, she whispered. A rare smile transformed his face. He leaned in, and their kiss was tender and searching, carrying all the unspoken promises and fragile hope they'd built together. Then the night shattered. A rifle cracked sharp and ugly. A cry of pain tore through the camp. A young warrior named Nico crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading across his buckskin shirt. They were under assault. A troop of Sierra Rurales, notorious for their brutality, had tracked them down. Chaos erupted. Gunfire and shouts ricocheted off the canyon walls. Nantan barked sharp commands, and the Apache warriors, who had been resting moments before, melted into rocks and shadows, becoming deadly phantoms. Koa shoved Mara Whitlock behind a boulder, his face a grim mask of focus. Stay here, he ordered, pressing a rifle into her hands. You know how to use this. Then he was gone, vanishing into the storm of gunfire to join his brother. Mara crouched alone, heart hammering against her ribs, the rifle heavy and cold in her hands. The battlefield's noise was a terrifying symphony of death. Peering over the boulder, she spotted a Sierra Rurales soldier sneaking toward her position, unaware of her. Her mind raced. She could hide, she could pray, or she could fight. She thought of Koa and Nantan, of the warriors who had accepted her, of Nico lying dead in the dust. A fire ignited within her. She was Ashka. She would not cower. Her hands steady against her own surprise, raised the rifle. Resting it on the rock, she took a deep breath and aimed just as Koa had taught her. She squeezed the trigger. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The soldier cried out and collapsed, clutching a wounded leg. A fierce, terrifying power surged through her. She was no longer a victim. She was a warrior. She reloaded and fired again and again, her shots covering the Apache fighters. The Sierra Rurales, expecting an easy slaughter, met a furious and deadly resistance. The fight raged, but eventually the surviving soldiers broke and fled into the darkness. Silence fell heavy and suffocating. Koa found her still behind the boulder knuckles, white on the rifle. He knelt beside her eyes, scanning her face. "You were brave," he said, awe in his voice. "You fought like a true Apache." Nantan, tending the wounded, looked over and gave a single curt nod. It was the highest praise she could receive. That night, her old life burned away in the heat of battle. A new woman had been forged her path now and, forever, the path of the mountain wind. The fragile peace they had won was as fleeting as a desert mirage. Word of the fight and the tale of a white woman standing with the Apache spread, hardening the resolve of those who hunted them. The bounty on Nantan's head rose, and the pursuit of their small fugitive band intensified. Colonel Harlan, known for his grim determination, tightened his hold on the borderlands with relentless cavalry patrols mirrored by the Mexican forces from the south. The Sierra Madre, once sanctuary, became a cage. Life on the run grew harsher. The constant movement frayed their nerves, hollowed their bellies. Warriors once proud grew weary, haunted by the specter of defeat. Mara's presence and the deep love between her and Koa became a strange paradox, a source of strength for some, a bitter poison for others. For Nantan, her courage was a beacon of hope, proof not all white people were enemies. But for Varric, heart-curdled by loss, she was a threat, a white devil who had bewitched Koa and weakened the war chief, a reminder of a world that had stolen everything. The end did not come in a glorious fight, but in a sun-bleached canyon deep in Mexico. They had been tracked, cornered, and led into a trap. An Apache scout, once a brother, had betrayed them for gold and pardon. The canyon walls were sheer. Freedom was blocked by a long line of blue-coated soldiers. Escape was impossible. Nantan, stoic and carved with grief, knew the long war was over. He gathered the last free Chiricahua warriors, women, children refusing to bow. Mara stood among them, hand clasped in Koa's. Fear had burned away, replaced by calm acceptance of their shared fate. She would face what was to come beside the man she loved and her people. Refusing to see them, slaughtered Nantan chose to parley. He would surrender, but on his terms. He strode into the open ground between the forces, hands raised, not in submission, but authority, a proud figure against the indifferent landscape. Colonel Harlan, who had spent years hunting this phantom of the mountains, met him face to face. Leader of the army and chief of the Apache resistance, stood under the desert sun, the fate of a people balanced between them. The negotiations became a tense battle of wills. Crook demanded nothing less than unconditional surrender. Nantan, his voice low but unwavering, spoke for the dignity of his people. He insisted on a reservation on their own sacred lands in Arizona, not a prison camp in a foreign swamp. He bargained for a future where his people could live with peace. As the two leaders spoke, Varric's despair morphed into burning rage. He could not bear the humiliation of surrender, the thought of living as a ward of the government he despised. His wild, hate-filled eyes found Mara Whitlock standing beside Koa. In his twisted grief, she was the cause of it all, the white woman who had brought them to this ignoble end. With a guttural cry that tore through the tense silence, he brought his rifle to his shoulder, but he did not aim at the soldiers surrounding them. He aimed at Mara. From the corner of his eye, Koa saw the betrayal. He shouted her name, Ashka, a desperate final warning. In a single fluid motion, he shoved her out of the bullet's path, placing his own body in its way. The rifle cracked through the canyon, a sharp, ugly sound, sealing their fate. Koa cried out as the bullet tore into his back. He collapsed into Mara's arms as she scrambled to catch him. A raw, primal scream ripped from her throat. She clutched him, his blood soaking her hands, her dress the dusty ground. Koa, she sobbed, tears mingling with his blood. No. Please, no. He looked up, life fading, but his eyes held infinite, heartbreaking love. Ashka, he whispered, voice shallow, rasping. My strong-hearted woman. Summoning his last strength, he lifted a trembling hand to her cheek. Live, he breathed. Live for both of us. His hand slipped away. The light in his dark, beautiful eyes went out. He was gone. Chaos erupted in the canyon. The truce shattered. American soldiers raised their rifles, believing they had been betrayed. The enraged Apache warriors, seeing Koa fall, prepared to charge. But Nantan, his face a mask of grief and rage, raised a hand. No, he roared, voice thick with sorrow, stopping every man in his tracks. There had been enough death that day. He strode toward Varric, who stood frozen, the smoking rifle still in his hands, face etched with horror at what he had done. Nantan stared at the man who had been loyal, now committing the ultimate betrayal. Without a word, he ripped the rifle from Varric's grasp and with a swift, powerful swing, struck him across the face. Varric sprawled in the dust, not dead, but condemned to a fate worse than death, cast out, banished, a man without a tribe, wandering alone with his shame. Then the great war chief, the man who had held 2 nations at bay, knelt beside the body of his brother. His broad shoulders shook with silent, racking sobs. He had lost the last of his family, the warrior who had stood by him through everything. He looked up at Mara, seeing in her tear-streaked, blood-stained face a grief that mirrored his own. In that moment, all boundaries vanished. They were not Apache and white outsider, but 2 souls bound by unbearable shared loss. The surrender that followed was solemn. The last free Chiricahua laid down their weapons. They were herded into wagons and began the long, humiliating journey north, destined for a reservation in the humid swamps of Florida, a green hell alien to their desert mountains. Mara insisted on going with them. She would not abandon the people who had become her family, the people for whom Koa had died. Colonel Harland, a hard man moved by her story and loyalty, granted her request. She lived out her days on the reservation, a quiet, respected figure, bridging 2 worlds. She never remarried, her heart forever bound to the memory of a love as fierce and bright as the desert sun. She became a keeper of memories, a storyteller for a new generation of Apache children who had never known freedom. She told the stories of their people, their sacred mountains, and the great warrior Koa, his courage, kindness, and love for the woman with the strong heart. Her life became a quiet testament to a promise kept. She had survived. The story of Mara, Whitlock, and Koa reminds us that the history of the West was not only about conflict and conquest, but also moments of courage, compassion, and human connection that crossed forbidden lines. One woman's choice, one act of defiance, sent ripples through the Apache resistance. Even in brutal times, bonds of love and shared humanity create legends. If this story of bravery, sacrifice, and forbidden love moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to follow more true, untold stories from the American West. All stories are created for entertainment purposes and may include fictional elements or dramatized interpretations inspired by historical settings. We use AI tools, voiceover visuals, scripts as creative assistants. However, all content is reviewed, refined, and edited by humans to ensure emotional authenticity and storytelling quality. We fully comply with YouTube's policies regarding AI-generated content and do not use any deepfake techniques or misleading recreations of real individuals. All visuals and supporting materials are properly licensed. Sharing, re-uploading, modifying, or distributing any part of this content in any form requires written permission. We appreciate your support and respect for original creative work.